End quote. Before we dive into this story, a quick note: this is mature content and absolutely not suitable for kids. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, let me ask you this: how far would you go to protect someone you love? For Rachel, a single mom navigating life after a messy divorce, that question led her down a path she never thought she and #039D take. A path full of secrets, blurred lines, and impossible decisions. At 38, Rachel had spent her entire life devoted to her family, especially her son Ethan, who had just turned 18. After years of shielding him from the pain of her crumbling marriage to his father, she was desperate to make sure he didn't repeat their mistakes. But when she discovered Ethan struggling with urges and behaviors that left him confused and ashamed, Rachel made a choice. A choice that would change everything. This story isn't just about Rachel's actions, though. It's also about the fallout, the cracks in the relationships she thought were unbreakable. Ethan, trying to figure out his own feelings in a world that's already overwhelming. Ethan's best friend, Caleb, who starts noticing things that don't quite add up. And even Rachel's ex-husband, Mike, who suddenly reappears with a warning Rachel never expected. And as if that wasn't enough, there's the shadow of infidelity looming in the background, one that ties all these characters together in a way none of them saw coming. How did Rachel end up in this situation? What was her real motivation? And, most importantly, can any of these relationships survive the truth? This is a story about love, betrayal, and the desperate lengths we go to when our lives are spiraling out of control. Stay with us as we unravel the choices, the secrets, and the heartache that led Rachel to a decision no one saw coming. Trust me, this is one story you don't want to miss. Let's get started. End quote. Rachel didn't plan for her life to take such a sharp turn. After her divorce from Mike, she had thrown herself into creating a stable home for Ethan. He was her pride and joy, a smart, kind young man on the cusp of adulthood. But lately, something about him had changed. He was withdrawn, moody, and there was a tension in the house Rachel couldn't ignore. It all started one evening when Rachel accidentally walked in on Ethan in his room. His face turned bright red, and he quickly tried to hide his laptop screen. Rachel didn't press him about it then. Teenage boys had their secrets, after all. But as the days went by, the guilt on his face and the way he avoided her grew impossible to ignore. One night, Rachel decided to break the ice. Over a quiet dinner, she asked Ethan, "Is everything okay? You've been different lately." At first, he brushed it off, mumbling something about school stress. But after a long pause, he finally blurted out, "Mom, I think there's something wrong with me." His words hit Rachel like a freight train. As Ethan haltingly explained his struggles, feelings he didn't know how to handle, the shame that came with them, Rachel realized her son wasn't just dealing with typical teenage growing pains. He was carrying a weight far heavier than she'd imagined. That night, Rachel lay awake, replaying the conversation in her head. She couldn't shake the image of Ethan's teary eyes, the vulnerability in his voice. As a mother, all she wanted was to make it better. But how? The solution came to her almost accidentally. A few weeks later, Rachel was at work. She managed a small boutique in town when a regular customer, Megan, stopped in. Megan was glamorous, confident, and open about the fact that she made her living as a dancer at a nearby club. That day, Megan offhandedly mentioned how the industry wasn't what people thought. Honestly, she laughed, "It's not about the men. It's about control. Owning your power." Rachel didn't say much at the time, but the words stuck with her. What if, Rachel wondered, there was a way to help Ethan without him ever knowing? A way to channel his urges, to give him a safe outlet that could somehow make the burden easier for him to bear? The idea was outrageous. Dangerous. But Rachel was desperate, and desperate people make choices that others can't understand. By the time Rachel made her first visit to the club where Megan worked, she had already convinced herself it was for the greater good. She'd be in control. She'd make sure Ethan never found out. But secrets like that never stay buried for long. Rachel's decision to step into Megan's world was meant to be temporary, a quick fix to a complicated problem. She told herself she would stop the moment she saw Ethan feeling more confident, more at ease with himself. But life rarely unfolds the way we plan. Her first night at the club was surreal. The pounding music, flashing lights, and the heavy scent of cologne and desperation made her feel out of place. Megan had promised to guide her through the ropes, but Rachel couldn't shake the shame gnawing at the back of her mind. Was this really the answer? But as Rachel became more comfortable on the stage, she noticed something unexpected: power. For the first time in years, she felt seen, desired, not as a mother or a woman rebuilding her life after divorce, but as someone with agency. She told herself this newfound confidence would make her a better parent, someone capable of helping Ethan navigate his struggles. Meanwhile, at home, Ethan's behavior began to shift. He seemed calmer, more present, even willing to engage in conversation during meals. Rachel convinced herself that whatever she was doing, it was working. What she didn't know was that Ethan wasn't just improving because of his mother's newfound confidence, he had a secret of his own. Unbeknownst to Rachel, Ethan had been sneaking out late at night. His best friend, Caleb, had taken him to the very club where Rachel worked, convincing him it was a rite of passage. Ethan was hesitant at first, but curiosity and the desire to fit in won out. The night Ethan stepped through those doors, Rachel was on stage. The dim lighting and his disbelief kept him from recognizing her at first. But when the spotlight hit her face, Ethan froze. His stomach churned as realization sank in. His mother, his mom, was on that stage. Ethan didn't tell Caleb what he'd seen. He barely spoke on the ride home, and once he was in his room, he sat in the dark, his mind racing. How could she do this? Was this about him? About money? A storm of anger, confusion, and guilt swirled inside him, leaving him feeling more alone than ever. And Rachel? She had no idea her carefully guarded secret was no longer a secret at all. Ethan couldn't unsee it. The image of Rachel under those flashing lights was burned into his mind, a grotesque blend of disbelief and betrayal. For days, he avoided her, claiming he was swamped with schoolwork or feeling under the weather. Rachel noticed, of course, but chalked it up to the usual teenage mood swings. She had no idea her world was teetering on the edge of collapse. At the same time, Ethan's anger began to fester. Questions kept looping through his head: why would she do this? Did she think so little of herself? Of me? Every answer he came up with only made him more furious. Worse, he couldn't bring himself to talk to Caleb, fearing the humiliation of admitting the truth. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt completely untethered, unsure of who he could trust. Rachel, meanwhile, was starting to lose control of the situation. What had begun as a calculated choice to help Ethan was quickly spiraling into something else entirely. She told herself she was only doing what was necessary. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the whole story anymore. The attention, the escape, it had become intoxicating. But it wasn't just Ethan's silence that unsettled her. Megan had been acting strangely, too, suddenly distant and evasive. One evening after work, Megan finally let it slip: "You should be careful, Rachel. Word gets around in places like this." When Rachel pressed her, Megan hesitated before saying, "Someone from the club recognized Ethan. I didn't want to tell you, but..." Rachel's stomach dropped. What? When? Who? Megan shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know who told me, but they said your son came in a few nights ago. I figured it couldn't be true, but now..." Panic gripped Rachel as she tried to process the implications. Had Ethan seen her? Did he know? Her heart raced as she realized how close everything was to falling apart. Unbeknownst to Rachel, Ethan had decided he couldn't keep quiet any longer. One night, as she came home from the club, she found him waiting in the kitchen. His eyes were dark, a mixture of anger and hurt. "Sit down," he said, his voice cold and unfamiliar. "We need to talk." Rachel froze, the weight of his words crashing over her. This was it. There was no running now. Rachel sat down slowly, her pulse pounding in her ears as Ethan glared at her from across the kitchen table. His jaw was clenched, his hands balled into fists, and for the first time, Rachel couldn't read her son's expression. "You want to tell me what you've been doing at that club?" Ethan's words were sharp, cutting through the tense silence. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. How could she explain this? That she had done it for him? That her choices, her sacrifices, were all for his sake? She finally managed, "Ethan, I can explain." But Ethan wasn't ready to listen. He stood abruptly, pacing the room as the emotions he'd been bottling up came spilling out. "Explain what? That you're dancing half-naked for random men? That I had to find out like that? Do you know how disgusting this feels? How humiliating." His voice cracked, the pain beneath the anger starting to show. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Ethan, please, you have to understand. I never meant for you to find out." "That's not the point," he interrupted. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Before Rachel could answer, a sound came from the doorway, a sharp intake of breath. Both of them turned to see Mike, Ethan's father, standing in the hallway, his face a mask of disbelief. "I was coming to drop off some papers," Mike said, holding up a folder as if to prove his point. "Did I just hear that right? Rachel, you're dancing?" The room froze. Rachel's mind reeled, trying to grasp the situation. This wasn't supposed to happen. Ethan wasn't supposed to find out. And Mike? What was he even doing here? Mike stepped into the room, his gaze shifting between Rachel and Ethan. "How long has this been going on?" he demanded, his tone cold. Before Rachel could respond, Ethan threw his hands up. "Great. Just perfect. Now he knows, too." He stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door to his room behind him. Rachel turned back to Mike, who was now glaring at her. "Is this what you've been doing while I've been paying child support?" Rachel's throat tightened, but before she could answer, Mike's voice dropped. "You'd better tell me everything, Rachel. Because if you think I'm letting this slide, you're wrong." As Rachel stood frozen in the storm of accusations, she realized the truth was no longer hers to control. Rachel felt cornered, her heart racing as Mike's questions pierced the tense silence. She looked at him, then at the door Ethan had slammed shut, her mind spinning. "Mike, you don't understand," she began, her voice trembling. "Then make me understand," he shot back. "Because right now, it looks like you've completely lost your way. What's this really about, Rake?" "Explain what? That you're dancing half-naked for random men? That I had to find out like that? Do you know how disgusting this feels? How humiliating." His voice cracked, the pain beneath the anger starting to show. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Ethan, please, you have to understand. I never meant for you to find out." "That's not the point," he interrupted. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Before Rachel could answer, a sound came from the doorway, a sharp intake of breath. Both of them turned to see Mike, Ethan's father, standing in the hallway, his face a mask of disbelief. "I was coming to drop off some papers," Mike said, holding up a folder as if to prove his point. "Did I just hear that right? Rachel, you're dancing?" The room froze. Rachel's mind reeled, trying to grasp the situation. This wasn't supposed to happen. Ethan wasn't supposed to find out. And Mike? What was he even doing here? Mike stepped into the room, his gaze shifting between Rachel and Ethan. "How long has this been going on?" he demanded, his tone cold. Before Rachel could respond, Ethan threw his hands up. "Great. Just perfect. Now he knows, too." He stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door to his room behind him. Rachel turned back to Mike, who was now glaring at her. Is this what you've been doing while I've been paying child support? Rachel's throat tightened, but before she could answer, Mike's voice dropped. You'd better tell me everything, Rachel. Because if you think I'm letting this slide, you're wrong. As Rachel stood frozen in the storm of accusations, she realized the truth was no longer hers to control. Rachel felt cornered, her heart racing as Mike's questions pierced the tense silence. She looked at him, then at the door Ethan had slammed shut, her mind spinning. Mike, you don't understand, she began, her voice trembling. Then make me understand, he shot back. Because right now, it looks like you've completely lost your way. What's this really about, Rake? She hesitated, debating how much to say. It was for Ethan, she admitted, her voice breaking. I did it for him. He's been struggling, emotionally, mentally, and I thought I could. I don't know, help him somehow. Mike stared at her, dumbfounded. You thought this was the way to help him? By humiliating yourself? By risking everything? Before Rachel could respond, Ethan's door flew open. He stood there, his face pale but determined. Stop, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Mom, I saw you because Caleb took me to that club. I didn't know you'd be there, and when I saw you, I freaked out. But I know why you did it. Rachel's breath hitched. Ethan? No, let me finish, he said, stepping into the room. I've been a mess. I know that. And yeah, finding out about you this way, it hurt. But Caleb told me something tonight, something I think you need to know. Rachel and Mike exchanged a confused glance before Ethan continued. One of the guys at the club has been asking questions about you. He found out who you are. And he's not just a customer, he's Dad's old friend, Brad. Mike's face darkened. Brad? You're kidding. Ethan shook his head. He said Brad told him everything. About your divorce. About Dad's cheating. And now he's bragging that he has pictures of you. He's planning to expose you, Mom. Rachel's blood ran cold. Brad had always been vindictive, feeding off other people's pain. She turned to Mike, panic flashing in her eyes. You have to stop him. Mike's jaw tightened. I'll handle Brad. But this is a mess, Rachel. And it's not just going to disappear. Just then, Ethan spoke up again. Mom, I don't care what anyone says. You did this for me, even if it wasn't the right way. I need to know we're going to be okay. Rachel pulled him into a tight hug, tears streaming down her face. But as Mike left the house, a dark thought lingered. Would Brad stay quiet, or had the damage already been done? In the days that followed, Rachel's life felt like it was held together by a fragile thread. She knew that Brad could strike at any moment, and the thought of her secret going public left her on edge. But with Mike on Brad's trail, she hoped there was still a chance to keep the situation contained. Meanwhile, things with Ethan began to heal, slowly but steadily. Their late-night kitchen confrontation had forced an honesty between them that neither had been prepared for, but it also brought them closer in a way Rachel hadn't anticipated. I don't care about the club, Mom, Ethan told her one night as they sat on the couch, sharing a bag of chips. I mean, it's weird, yeah, but I get it now. You didn't know what else to do, and you were trying to help me. Rachel gave him a small smile, brushing his hair out of his face like she had when he was younger. I never wanted you to feel like you were alone, Ethan. I've made mistakes, but everything I've done has always been for you. Things with Mike were more complicated. Although his anger had cooled, their conversations remained tense. Mike admitted that he had confronted Brad, but the details of what was said, and whether Brad would truly stay silent, remained unclear. I took care of it, Mike assured Rachel during one terse phone call. But Rachel, you need to think about the choices you're making. Not just for Ethan, but for yourself. This can't happen again. Rachel agreed. It was time to close this chapter of her life and focus on rebuilding, not just for Ethan, but for herself, too. She quit the club, promising to find healthier, more sustainable ways to support her son and their family. As weeks turned into months, the storm seemed to pass. Brad stayed silent, perhaps deterred by Mike's intervention, and Rachel worked to repair the trust between her and Ethan. They weren't perfect, but they were moving forward together, and as Rachel sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset with Ethan, she realized something.